Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness. And Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about self-worth. Very important and something I've had to kind of discover for myself over the years. But Donovan, what are your initial thoughts when it comes to self-worth?
So the first thing that came to mind is I actually kind of want to ask you a question, which is, do you feel like there is a difference between self-worth and self-esteem? Because I'm trying to think that out for myself right now, and I'm not sure if I use those two words any differently. And mainly I say that so that the conversation can be informed by, I've thought a lot about self-esteem and a lot less about the term self-worth. So I'm trying to see if there's a difference that we can pick apart, or if I should fall back on some of those other things I've thought about before.
Yeah, I haven't really distinguished for myself the difference. I mean, I don't think I use them interchangeably. Or, honestly, I feel like I'm more likely to use self-worth versus self-esteem. I don't know why. Maybe through just all the various things I've done. And that I think it's important to have both. I feel like self-esteem, I think of like teenagers and they're lacking, but I think maybe it's an age thing where self-worth is something where it's an ongoing journey that we're discovering and working at. And yeah, but I don't know how I would distinguish the two, honestly, aside from maybe age range. Yeah.
Well, the only thing that I can think of is sometimes when people say self-esteem, they're also talking about confidence. Sometimes that gets like melded into the same thing, which I don't think is in the same place as self-worth, right? It's like how much you value yourself.
Right.
I don't think about it that way, but I think maybe some people do. But for me, I think esteem and worth are probably roughly the same. I don't know. I don't have a clear way to distinguish them, but I do agree that there's a lot more negative connotations with self-esteem because of, I feel like things like, oh, we have to like build up everyone's self-esteem, and then like participation trophy type of conversation deal thing that goes that direction.
Right.
And I think like a lot of people just don't like that or disagree with that set of ideas. But as far as like what the terms mean and the distinction between the two, I don't know that I necessarily have one. So unless you think of one, I'll probably proceed with I'll probably kind of use the two interchangeably.
Yeah. I don't know if you would resonate with this or if you'd agree. I kind of like, I guess one of the subtle differences I might add to what I added before or what I said before is that I feel like self-worth is weighted heavier in terms of development. I'm not sure. I don't know. Those are my initial thoughts. So what do you think of that?
Yeah. See, I guess for me, the big piece is that I haven't used self-worth much. It's not a term that I'm like too familiar with. And I think most of the places that other people have probably used worth, I've used esteem. Yeah. So anyway, we don't need to go into the nuances of what the words mean like forever. But
yeah,
at a high level, self-worth is basically, just like how much do you value yourself, or do you value yourself? And I feel like there's a fine line to be drawn between sort of valuing yourself in terms of you are like a valuable and worthwhile person, and like valuing yourself in the sense of something that becomes like sort of like arrogant and like, oh, I'm the best and my time is worth more than everyone else's. And like, I just be curious on your thoughts between like sort of that interplay, right? Because I feel like it's a fine line, but maybe you disagree or feel like there's a nice way to like tease that out.
I mean, I get what you're trying to, I think I get what you're trying to get at. When I think of self-worth, it's like, oh, I don't know. I don't associate with people that are arrogant, really. I would just call them arrogant, or like my time is worth more than others. I wouldn't associate that make that connection. But when I think of self-worth, I think it's people are like a there's a lacking or a missing in the self-worth aspect, that they're not worthy of good things, or they're not worthy of a good relationship, or good things don't never happen to them kind of a mentality.
Yeah, so tell me if I'm missing here, but
Yeah.
it sounds like the way that you think about it or have experienced it is sort of more like a binary of like
Mm-hmm.
either you value yourself or you don't, kind of. And
Right.
I think the way I was talking about it is more like a spectrum where like the question would be like, is there a point where you can have too much self-worth? And I guess it just depends on what
Mm,
you mean by that and how you're looking at it, right? Because like that's kind of what I was trying to get at is like, do you feel like there's a point where it's like, oh, my self-worth is too high? But if you're looking at it more as like
mhm.
self-worth is either like you value yourself or you don't. It's not
Right.
as much a spectrum of like how much you value yourself.
Right.
Then I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of like it can't be too high. Like you just either you value yourself and think that you are worthy of like good things or
Mhm.
however else that plays out or not.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. That's kind of how I see it. That's a good summary. So, what do you feel? So it sounds like you haven't had a whole lot of, or you haven't used this term or do you identify with this term that much? Is what you were saying before? Do you, or do you want to clarify?
It's not that I don't identify with it as much as like to me it fits in the exact same space in my head as self-esteem. Like there's not a difference. Although I guess I have thought about esteem in terms of like a scale and instead of a binary, which is like a subtle distinction, at least in the way that we're talking about it right now.
Mhm.
Um, but it's not. It's less. It's more like when you're speaking to someone from England or something that uses a word that means the same thing, but it's not a word
Right.
that you tend to use.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
more in that bucket than like this isn't something that I like identify with at all.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, one thing I would say that it's been an ongoing journey for myself, but I realized in my younger years, I didn't realize that was like an issue, or that I was like
Mm.
lacking in self-worth. And it took me doing a lot of like personal development work and working with trained professionals to help me explore that and recognize like, oh yeah, these certain actions, or me putting up with certain like bad behavior from partners and relationships was essentially me lacking self-worth to like break up with them or say no or set boundaries. And I just didn't make that association, because I don't know if it's something like people realize out of the blue unless they're working with someone to like identify and recognize, oh, maybe that is something I need to work at. It was just something I had to discover that was and sometimes it's still an ongoing thing for me, where I feel like, oh, I'm not doing something good enough, or oh, I could be doing this better. And like those types of like inner dialogue conversations come up, and I'm like, no, let's take a step back, be like, I'm doing the best I can, like more positive reinforcement instead of like the negative self-talk is like an ongoing journey for me.
So following up on that, I'd be curious if you have, and it could be imagined or real, it doesn't really matter, but like sort of an example of a situation or something that you went through and sort of like how you would have thought about it in the past when you felt like your self-worth was low
Mm-hmm.
and how you would think about it now. Just so like, there's like a clearer distinction between the two so people can see like here's how I was thinking before and here's how I think now, because you were saying like you weren't able to see it easily, so maybe having some comparisons will help.
Yeah, yeah, actually, and I don't know if I've shared this story before, but I remember like a clear example was actually when I was dating before I met my husband, and I was just like putting myself out there and going on dates and doing a lot better than I was when I was in my 20s, where I just let, people walk all over me or just not treat me as well as I should be. But I remember there was an incident where I went out with a guy and the date went well. We even kissed at the end of the day. So I was like, and then we scheduled a second date. And what happened was, like, I thought everything went well. We scheduled the second date. I think our first date was maybe on like a Thursday or Friday, and the next date was going to be on a Monday or Tuesday. And so we had like the weekend, and I had a weekend class, so I knew I wasn't going to be able to be very responsive in text message. And so I don't know what happened, but over the course of the weekend we were texting and it was like flirty and fun, and then like over the course, and I wasn't able to like do a whole lot, and I'm not sure if this was contributing to anything, but basically like by the end of the weekend he was like, I don't think this is going to work out. I like, yeah, basically. And then so kind of canceling the date, but not like actually saying the words, and then not really giving me any explanation. I got very upset because I was like, well, what happened? Was it because I wasn't texting enough over the weekend? Was it something I said on the first date? Was it something I did? Was it like where I lived? Was it like a piece of food in my teeth? I started to spiral in my head and thinking like, what did I do? And then like he basically ghosted me. He didn't like give me anything and didn't respond, just like left it as like, yeah, like not a good fit, and just left it at that. Ghosted me, didn't give me any response, and I was just trying to like figure it out. And I think what I did in my younger years, where I was just like trying so hard to like fix it or make it better, and then I really had to take a step back and like think, it's like, do I really want to be with a guy who doesn't communicate or doesn't like, or ghosts me? And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm worthy of more than that. This is someone I don't want to be with. Why am I obsessing about the reason why he doesn't want to be with me? One, I don't want to be with someone who doesn't want to be with me. So let's just leave it at that. Drop it, stop spiraling in my head. And I think that was something I recognize when I do the mental spiraling, which I think, a lot of people are guilty of doing, and it's normal. And that was a shitty thing that he did. But like moral of the story, it's just like I had to catch myself and be like, I'm worth more than this shitty behavior, and just drop it. It's not, this is someone I don't want to be with, rather than like figuring out what I need to do to fix myself so he'd want to be with me.
So I heard, or I think like the piece that stood out to me is sort of this idea of, instead of internalizing everything, like that's kind of like the lower self-worth path of just like, oh, everything is my fault. Like I have to figure out what I screwed up. I have to figure out how to do better.
Mm-hmm.
A more realistic path of like, and I heard this whole thing, but like, oh, there is more than just what I'm doing at play here. Potentially there's something that I did, right? You're like, have food in my teeth, or like potentially there is something that I did, right? Like some sort of action that influenced the outcome, but not in a way that's like 100% of this outcome is my fault in this like interpersonal experience.
Right.
So it sounds like that was like the shift that was a lot more useful, is instead of just bringing everything in and trying to, I mean, I guess partially it was for yourself, but also I heard as like a subtext, like what could I have done to make this other person like me more or be happier, or however you want to phrase that.
Right.
So like implicitly there's some amount of like, what could I have done to just like make this person feel good? And I don't want to say that explicitly this is what happened, but like some piece of like worth around like your worth is lower than theirs because you should be doing something to make them happy.
Right.
Whereas like the position you ended on was more like, well, if we're equals, right, and we both have value, then like the behaviors that this person is exhibiting towards me, not responding to anything I'm saying, is not something that I want to put up with. So it's not like I'm adding anything to what you said. I'm just trying to like break down all the different parts that I saw, and like that resonates with me too, in terms of times that I have felt like low self-worth are times that I have been internalizing it's mostly been interpersonal situations. Maybe we can dig that out a little bit more, but interpersonal situations where I have taken responsibility for everything
Mhm.
and felt like, regardless of someone else's behavior, them not feeling good or not liking me or whatever else was my fault and I should have changed something.
Right.
Um, and sort of with the same pathway through, like, the only time that I can really think of it is through a, like, really bad relationship. And then I was just beating myself up for a really long time until I realized, like, kind of like what you were saying is like, well, this other person did all of this other stuff.
Mhm.
And like, it's not necessarily a reflection of me. That's when that specific piece is what really got me anchored into a good place.
Mhm.
Because before I was thinking like, this person is treating me really badly. I do everything I can to treat them nicely.
Mhm.
What am I doing wrong?
Right.
Which is so interesting because, like, it didn't open up the door of, well, what are they doing wrong? Like, didn't
Right.
open
Yeah,
up
like
until way down the line.
Yeah. Yeah. And that took a while for me to like learn and discover that, because throughout my 20s, I was just like in very short-term relationships, and it was like 1 to 3 months, and you know, like when they started being like distant or cold, I would try to like work harder and like probably be a little needy or desperate, and that didn't really work out the situation, rather than reflecting on like, what do I need in a partner? Like, what are the qualities that I need, rather than like change myself or try to be like over the top accommodating to what they want, and not really reflecting about what I want or what I need in a relationship. So that took a while.
Yeah, it's, in my experience, not an easy journey at all.
Yeah. Mhm.
But yeah, I do think at the core of it, it's like when you value yourself low,
Mhm.
then you implicitly sort of value others higher than you.
Mhm.
And that causes all kinds of places that you're basically, well, like you're saying, it can cause you being like needy or
Yeah.
dependent, but it can also cause you just like being really, really subservient in a way that your needs don't get met at all.
Right. Yeah.
Um, I would be curious because, you mentioned that over the long term journey, you
Mhm.
did a bunch of different work and like talk to people and like professionals and
Yeah.
coaching and stuff.
Mhm.
I'd be curious if there's anything that stood out to you as ways that helped sort of build your self-worth, like exercises or anything that you were able to do. Maybe it was like talking with a specific type of professional or something like that, but just what seems to have worked best for you.
Honestly, I think one of the biggest things that I have done, and we're gonna do a podcast about this at some point, is doing a personal development course called the Landmark Forum. And how that helped, because I mean, I did a lot, like a decade of therapy. I did a bunch of different types of therapies and modalities. But I think what healed me to the point of being able to have healthy relationships was recognizing that when I was younger, I created like these stories in my head that I wasn't worthy as a child to my father, or I was a disappointment of a daughter, was like the stories I was telling myself, even though that wasn't necessarily the reality of the case. And so I had like not very connected relationship with my father, not a bad relationship. He wasn't a bad father. He provided, but we just were very superficial in our relationship. And I just basically blamed my father for why I kept attracting emotionally unavailable men, because it's my father that's emotionally unavailable. This is just what happens. But doing the Landmark Forum helped me realize that, one, those were stories I created about him and about myself. And so I could like separate the two. And it helped me like propel me into action to actually get complete with my father, to heal that, to recognize that I am worthy, that I am lovable, and like recognizing that was a story, and that my father actually really does love me, and that I am worthy of love. Kind of like getting complete with that relationship, which is like one of the most biggest important relationships with a man in my life. I think that kind of helped break that cycle that therapy alone wasn't quite able to do. So for me, that was the big thing, but I attribute like I benefited from all the various things that I've done, whether that was working with a professional or a book. And I did a lot of self-love books and that helped. And it helped me recognize, wow, these are not so healthy patterns. And it helped me kind of build my self-worth over time, just with all the different tools that I utilized.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, self-worth in and of itself is sort of a mental model or a pattern of behaviors, right? So like to be able to change it, you have to either get new models, right? You have to like learn new things about ways that you can interact or whatever else, or you have to build new patterns. Because like you're saying, like if that's the main pattern that you had for interacting with men, and then you mapped it onto all your relationships, then like you're gonna have sort of the same, I mean, not the same outcomes, but like same sort of like problem structure, I guess.
Right.
Just to add on, sort of the thing for me that helped a lot is kind of different from yours, but I used to also have a lot more problems with self-worth. For me, what helped a lot was sort of developing out my life more. And by that, I mean like chasing down goals and hobbies that I found meaningful and fulfilling. So like when my self-worth was the lowest, it was when I played a lot of video games, a ton. Like that's basically the only thing I did. I guess I also played soccer competitively, but it wasn't something, neither of those things were things that I felt value in doing. Now that might be different from someone else, right? Like I've met plenty of people who play a lot of sports and derive a lot of self-worth from that, right? Like it bolsters their personality, but for me it didn't. So when I started switching into some of the things I'm doing now, like writing and doing podcasts and just like working on these various projects, that helped me immensely and was able to give me a lot more worth in interactions too, because the main way that this was playing out was in romantic relationships. And since I didn't really have anything else going on, I would sort of focus all my attention and energy into the relationship in a way that was like very overbearing and needy and just like not pleasant. You know, like in retrospect, I can see that that was not correct. But it was because you know, I felt like, oh, like I don't really have anything to offer. So what I do have to offer is just like my attention unbounded, which is not necessarily the recipe for a healthy relationship. So I just wanted to add in like that's sort of the path or the thing that was able to help me a lot and help me also in those interactions value myself at the same as other people, right? Because it wasn't before where I was like, I'm not really bringing, like I have no value really, so I'll just do whatever seems nice for you, to something a little bit more healthy.
Yeah. When you said that, like I don't have anything to offer, or I don't like the idea of like I don't have much to offer or anything to offer, it kind of also made me associate with like it's not just like personal development is great, but I also think it comes from like experience. And like the more relationships you're in, the more people you date, you start to like realize like what I need and what boundaries I have. And I made the association of like even with like work, I was like a brand new fresh doctor. I felt like I'm fresh out of school. Like I don't know, I'll take any job at like ridiculously low pay or just do anything. And like put up with like things that I definitely wouldn't put up with now. But now that I'm been a doctor for 10 years, if I wanted to go for a position, it's like, it's not like I'll take whatever anyone offers me basically, because I'm like, need it. It's not that. I'm like, I have enough experience. I have enough self-worth in my career, and I know I've accomplished a lot and I've achieved a lot and helped a lot of people, that it's like if they don't meet my requirements, like whether it's pay or certain parameters or things that I would want to make it a good partnership in a way, like a win-win for both of us, then I would walk away, because it's just not worth it if they're not going to offer enough or offer like what I need. Like I need a flexible schedule. That's super important to me. And if I don't get that, then no thanks. I got other things I can be doing with my time. So I see the relationships, romantic relationships, in a similar way. It's like the more that you have, you build your experience. You realize like what you can put up with and what you can't, and you gain more perspective.
Well, I think you bring up a really interesting point, which is like self-worth in different domains or categories, right? Because I feel like what I've experienced most often is people who have or lack self-worth in only certain domains, and
Right.
then they have it in other ones.
Right.
So that might be another interesting place for people to explore. I don't know how fruitful it'll be because it's not the path I took, but
Right.
just to see the parallels in like places that you are able to draw strong boundaries or maintain a sense of worth and transport that into other places. Because I sort of found that for me, when I was developing those sort of like skills and interests and hobbies and whatnot, that my self-worth went up in most domains just by chance. But I imagine if you're able to sort of see the patterns that allow you to go to work and say, like, this is the type of work that I'm willing to do. And if you can sort of, I don't know, channel that feeling or those patterns or whatever you want to call it and move that into somewhere where you're weaker, say it's like in romantic relationships,
Mhm.
and sort of at least use that as a baseline to try to like build towards,
Mhm.
that might be a fruitful way for people to sort of build up self-worth in other domains. That being said, it might not be. It might be that there are in those domains, like you were saying, certain relationships or patterns that you have from the past that you have to unwind first, instead of just going directly to like, oh, I'm confident at work and value myself. Oh, now I'll just do it over here. It might not be that simple or straightforward.
Always align it up. Yeah, yeah, it took a little bit more work, I think, in the relationship realm than the work realm. It just made me think of like I just read this article about this company that was bought out. I think it was like some type of manufacturing, and they basically, and a lot of these employees had worked there for 15 plus years. And they basically like fired everyone. And they were like, oh, yeah, if you want your job, just reapply under the new.
Mm.
And they offered like worse benefits, and basically zero people reapplied because of like how they were treated was so poorly. And they were like, not worth it. And most of them were like, well, I might as well retire. What's the point? And then that company basically got screwed because they were very niche, and they needed like very highly skilled trained people to be able to conduct that job. So I was like, yeah, that's what I thought of.
That does bring up another interesting point, which is like, you know, in that example, it's very clear, but I feel like a lot of times, like you were saying, people might not even be aware of how low they're valuing themselves. Like it's easy when,
Yeah.
you know, at a company, like, okay, here's my exact compensation. Cool. Do you want the same job for 25% less? Like, you know, you like can see a clear disconnect in the value, but
Right.
for other like domains and things, sometimes you have to uh step out of the situation you're in and look at the more generic picture. So for example, like that one relationship I had that was really not good. I
Mhm.
mean, I hadn't really had any other serious relationships. So
Yeah.
for me, it took me a really long time to recognize like this is not a
Mhm.
good benefits package. Like what I'm being offered
Right,
is
exactly.
at a very low percent of what's available out in the world.
Right.
So, you know, just another thing that might be helpful is sort of stepping back from whatever situation it is and looking at what you are getting relative to what's available. Because in some instances, like you were saying, if you're at the start of your career, I did the same thing when I switched into software. If you're at the start of your career, like what's available to you based on where you are
Mhm.
is probably not much. Like it pays or it can be effective to be a little bit more like, oh, I'll just kind of like start with whatever and build up some experience.
Yeah.
But for example, if you switch to like relationships, right? If you look around at just all the romantic relationships people have, like
Mhm.
there are plenty of healthy, stable relationships. So if what you're getting is something where you're treated badly or
Mhm.
whatever other million negative things there are that come out in relationships, like that's not necessarily what you should accept because there's other better things available.
Totally. Yeah, that just reminded me of my very first relationship, which was terrible because he was a lying, cheating bastard. But I also had zero self-worth and just put up with like ignoring the red flags, young and naive. And just like, looking back, I'm like, oh my God, I was so like immature and ridiculous that I put up with some of those red flags. But like, also aside from that, it's just like we were on and off. It's like, I remember being like, oh, trying to always accommodate him in his schedule and not really like factoring in my schedule. I'll like move things around so we can spend time together. I do that versus like now it's like, no, it's both ways. It goes both ways, dude. And then the other thing I remember about like where I didn't set a boundary or like should have walked away was just like, he was really weird about like having the boyfriend girlfriend label. It's like left it big and super ambiguous for over a year. And I was like shocked when he was finally like well over a year, maybe a year and a half, that he was like ready to call me his girlfriend. And I was like, now I'd be like, yeah, if we've been together for a month or two, I'm like ready. And if he's prolonging it or kind of like dancing around it, I'm like, pass. I don't need to deal with this shit. Bye. I feel like my barometer or my tolerance for shitty behavior is like so much lower. And I don't think I've been with anyone since him that has cheated on me because I developed a standard. Like, yes, he has to be loyal and honest. It's a huge standard now, but I didn't quite obviously have that, or I didn't recognize the red flags to indicate that he was cheating. But now I'm like, yeah, no, that's a really, really huge priority that I absolutely 100% need in any relationship moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess part of it is over time you develop more tools for figuring out the kinds of things that you like. Once you have clearer targets on what you need, you also can develop better tools for like making sure that those needs are met correctly. Because I imagine, I mean, this is what happened to me, is just like there were certain things I needed or wanted out of a relationship, but I didn't really have tools to communicate that super well or to dig out sort of the answers I was looking for. And I didn't have the self-worth to like set those boundaries, right? So like this big ambiguous pile of mess turned into even worse mess just because I didn't have the ability to like guide things to where they needed to be. You know what I mean? So like in the same way, if you were in a new relationship after a month or two and like wanted to like say like, okay, well, how are we going to label this, whatever, and the person pushed back, like you'd probably have developed tools around like, cool, well, like we're gonna take this to a resolution some way or another. So like,
yeah,
let's do the work needed instead of
like
from that earlier stage of just like, okay, I guess like
right, just going along with whatever they want. Yeah. That actually made me think of another, situation where like many years after this first boyfriend situation, my last serious relationship, actually, when that ended, it was like a 3.5-year relationship, and he was a great boyfriend, very loving, treated me well, but I didn't recognize another need that I needed in a relationship. It wasn't until we broke up, and mainly we broke up because he was just still unsure about kids. And I thought that was like the main reason we were breaking up. But later on, I just recognized like something that I really need is someone who is willing to pursue his own personal growth, or whether that's therapy or books or classes, whatever that might be. That is super important to me because it's something I do for myself. And it's like, I've done so much work and I don't expect him to be at the same level of me or has done as much as what I have done, but I need him to be willing to grow to some degree, because if it's like, if we're at a huge, major emotional development degree, that is going to make it really difficult and hard. And so it's like, he's got to learn to develop himself and take on getting help if he needs it. So that wasn't something I recognized till after I broke up with my last partner. And my current husband is definitely very always open to explore new things. And that's been great. And that's why I feel like even though there have been really hard times in my current relationship, it's like because of our willingness to both grow, we've been able to overcome every challenge that we have faced, and that has been really beneficial.
Yeah, this is only tangentially related, but what you're talking about made me realize or think about, like, when you're thinking about your self-worth, the types of relationships you're in really make a big difference,
Yeah.
because like people may be really like dragging you down or pushing you down, and it can take some space for you to even have, like, I guess what I'm getting at is if you have like repeated and constant feelings of low self-worth,
Mhm.
and um you've you should look at your relationships and like step back and see what those interactions are like, because sometimes it's um people just by happenstance or just because you're offering it will like, you want to change your schedule to accommodate me, cool, like awesome. But then there's other people who are like intentionally trying to keep your like self-worth low and manipulate you and do things like that. So if it's something you're really struggling with, it's worth, and it's way easier said than done, but
Mm.
trying to step out and sort of evaluate what's going on, and just going back to like what we were talking about before, if you can pattern match against other relationships that are healthy, like not necessarily yours if you don't have any, but also maybe yours, that can help you sort of compare and contrast how bad some of the relationships really are, because it's easy to get into these like really bad patterns. And the reason I thought of this is because you're kind of talking about the opposite, where like
Right.
you're talking about helping each other work on things.
Mhm.
But I know a lot of people that struggle with this are in relationships, whether it's romantic or not, that have the opposite pattern, where people are almost intentionally, or even if it's not intentional, just very consistently pushing against self-worth.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really important point you brought up, because I definitely have heard and know people who have been in relationships where I think that's something to, again, like we have mentioned in the beginning, that it's sometimes hard to recognize when you're like deep in it. It's helpful to take a step back and like reflect. So possible like red flags or warning signs is just like, if that person's constantly putting you down, that's definitely not healthy or helpful. And also I think another thing that I thought of is like someone who tries to like isolate you from other people, interact like maybe with your family or your friends, and so that way like all the feedback you're getting is from this person that's constantly putting you down, and that just lowers your self-worth significantly, and you just start to believe whatever that person might be saying. And so it's helpful to get other perspective outside of your partner and talk to people. And if that makes your partner upset, then you have to evaluate like what you really need out of a partner. Is if this person is going to be super controlling and not let me see my family, then that's something I would question.
And I just want to expand it too, because it's not just partners.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I've definitely seen people with parents
Mm-hmm.
who fall into this category, or like some splitting of the categories of like, oh, they're just constantly putting this person down. Wow, that really sucks. Or like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, they're really trying to like not let this person interact with anyone else or develop any friendships or relationships, or they're trying to like force this person onto this specific path, and whenever they do something different or express interest in something different, they put them down and say
Right.
like, that's stupid, that's a waste of time, or whatever else. So
Right.
I wasn't saying that you were, saying it was only romantic relationships, but I want to
Right.
really highlight that like it can
Oh
be
yeah.
any sort of relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and that's something to recognize and like separate yourself from, if it's possible, because that's not necessarily helping your self-worth situation. And that's like something I had to learn. It's like I wasn't really ever put in a situation like a sort of abusive situation, but I feel like I put myself of like not giving like the hardest part for me in learning self-worth was like walking away, because it's like if there's like love or affection, or it makes it infinitely harder. But it's like you have to recognize your own self-worth to be able to walk away, when it's an unhealthy situation.
Yeah, I feel like it's tough because you get in, a lot of people are in situations where it's hard to, especially like you're talking about, if your relationships have been limited or you don't have that much experience or whatever else, it gets really hard because it's either this like known shitty thing or the unknown possibly shittier thing, but it's not. In general, it's not, right? Like if you're in that bad of a situation, if you walk away, like typically you move to something better, but depending on your pathway and sort of your background, it can be hard to know that you're moving towards something better. And that's another thing that really messed me up when I was younger, is not not being willing or not understanding that I could walk away into better options and thinking like, well, this is the one thing that I have, so I either have this or I have nothing, which so it was just not realistic.
Right, exactly. And just because someone might say they love you, or maybe they actually do love you, that's not necessarily enough to stay in a relationship. Like if that person's being terrible to you and putting you down, but they still tell you I love you, and I know that can create like an inner conflict, but that's, something you have to really evaluate, and that sometimes love isn't enough. And it's like when you think like, well, nobody will love me if I walk away from this person, that's some like a thought process I think you really need to reevaluate and be like, actually, it's possible someone else could love you. But you have to build your self-worth and then you become more lovable.
Well, this also usually doesn't land emotionally, but like logically, there are billions of people in the world. Like there's got to be at least a couple out there that be
Right.
okay with you.
Right, exactly. All right, well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Were there any final thoughts you had before we wrap up?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share your stories of self-worth and how you've built that over the years. All right. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.